Hello and welcome, I'm Joshua Barnes, and today we will be diving into a discussion on the ongoing Los Angeles wildfires. Devastating wildfires in Los Angeles have left a trail of destruction, claiming lives and reducing celebrity mansions to rubble. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass is facing sharp criticism for her handling of the devastating wildfires currently ravaging the region. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden has described the fires as catastrophic and the worst in the city's history. President-elect Donald Trump and his supporters, however, have blamed Mayor Bass and California Governor Gavin Newsom, accusing them of gross incompetence. The fires have killed at least 10 people and destroyed over 5,300 structures in Pacific Palisades, home to Hollywood's elite. In the wake of the destruction, 20 people have been arrested for looting abandoned homes, leading to curfews in affected areas. Arson investigations are underway, further intensifying the tragedy. Today, we are joined by three guests. Firstly, we have Alex Izzat, a UK-based journalist in London. We have Ross Feingold, a political risk analyst in Taipei, and Irina Zuckerman, a senior journalist from New York. Irina, being based in America, I'd like to come to you first. We're seeing an ongoing situation with these fires continuing to rip through LA. What is the feeling at the moment in the US and how is it being reported on? Do you think that it's going to be continuing forward and what do you think the reaction is?
Well, the reaction is absolutely horrified. People are... There are about 180,000 people who've been displaced so far as a result of these fires, and it's not just the celebrities in fancy mansions. It's quite a lot of many ordinary people just living in the area. There's been billions worth of destruction, and I think there is just a feeling of loss even in areas that are quite far from California. Because of the horrifying imagery of the fires engulfing not only forests but even streets and buildings. In terms of reporting, there's been a lot of the emphasis, of course, on the wind conditions, which and weather patterns and climate conditions that contributed to this disaster, and indeed. California is prone to winter dryness, to high winds that caused multiple outbreaks across the state and stretched the already thin resources even thinner, making it nearly impossible for the firefighters to get everywhere at the same time. There were also human factors such as arson incidents, as well as the fact that many are currently criticizing some of the local authorities for cutting the budget for firefighters by 17 million relatively shortly before this happened. There's also been more long-term shortages of firefighters since the pandemic. Many firefighters were fired or forced out for refusing to take the COVID vaccine and never rehired afterwards. So there's a conglomeration of factors. Unfortunately, much of the media, and especially not so much the reporters, but the various talking head personalities, are emphasizing some factors over others, depending on their political perspective. But in reality, it's a complex confluence of factors that are contributing to the scale of the disaster at hand.
Alex Izzat, I'll come to you next. Apologies for my pronunciation mistake earlier. Looking at the impact of this, potentially politically, Donald Trump, since knowing that he was becoming president and during his campaign, has spoken about oil production. He's spoken about rolling back on environmental saving policies and looking to continue and ramp up production in turn, working against environmental pacts and plans. Do you think the fact that this is impacting celebrities might have an impact on how they react to Donald Trump and his policies?
I think when it comes to Donald Trump and his policies, it's a wider issue than these particular fires that are continuing in Los Angeles. He has obviously called out Gavin Newsom, especially because Gavin Newsom supposedly could have increased the water to the area, but instead chose to protect some small fish called smelts. And obviously, Donald Trump has been posting everywhere he can with regards to this. But when it comes down to protecting large areas, including Los Angeles, these fires do happen often, not to this scale. This was unprecedented. But there are a lot of issues in the run-up. Your last guest mentioned there's $17 million worth of cuts. Also, a lot of other concerns and problems with the fire service in itself. No one expected these fires to get to this level. But when it comes down to whether Donald Trump would look to cut water, would cut climate issues, I don't think that he would be that incredulous with regards to America. He has always said America first. That's his huge policy, and it's his overarching campaign, which he ran with to get those votes. So I think when it comes to environmental issues, when it comes to factories and building, that is a quite different issue to making sure that communities do have enough water to put out fires if they start. There are a lot of reports, experts suggesting that if a few of those fires in Malibu had been put out straight away and there was enough resources, enough fire people, enough fire trucks, it wouldn't have got to this stage. And sadly, it's always looking back instead of looking forward.
Ross Feingold, without taking it too far away from the devastation and the scenes that we're seeing, but looking past this and once we get to a point where there will be a review and there will be a cleanup, the financial implications are going to be huge. We've seen over $130 billion of damage already. Do you think this is something that could be an important moment in any political party moving forward, whether that's the Democrats looking to battle against Trump or Trump as he starts his party and his inauguration in the presidency?
That's a really interesting question because California votes overwhelmingly Democrat. President Trump did not win California's electoral votes. Although something to remember in that regard is California votes Democrat in presidential or Senate elections because there are a few very large population centers, most notably Los Angeles and San Francisco. Large parts of California, especially in rural areas, are actually conservative. They vote for Republicans. They vote for Republicans to represent their district in the House, for example. But going forward in the next few weeks, what will be interesting to watch is, are there any proposals, probably from Democrats, to give California a much larger federal government assistance as a response to this crisis and this disaster, and whether or not Republicans in the House and in the Senate and ultimately President Trump will support giving California more money. This is something that always plays out whenever there's a natural disaster, whether that's wildfires or hurricanes. And what we often see is that there's certain congressmen who oppose this kind of federal assistance when it's not in their district. But when it happens to their district or their state, suddenly certain congressmen who opposed it for other places are suddenly big advocates for their own districts to receive additional federal aid.
Irina Tsukaman, winds have died down and were expected to die down, but they are picking up once again. The devastation that's going to be caused could stretch beyond what it already is and to the level where it's the worst fire in the area ever. Is there a real fear that the damage could be exponentially more? And yeah, in terms of those people living there, they must be going through the toughest of times at the moment.
Yes, of course, there's a concern that this story is far from over. This is, of course, not the first such incident. In 2020, there were devastating fires in a similar area, also destroyed a lot of mansions as well as housing for the regular people living there. But I think the scale of this particular incident is outstanding and far beyond what happened in 2020, and also I think there is actually more public attention to as well to this particular situation right in the middle of January. It's going to be tough. It's going to be tough not only to rebuild all of that, to have a plan to return all these people home as quickly as possible. The damage is not only in what has already been destroyed, but in the long-term plans to not only contain the disaster, but also rebuild in a way that takes these environmental factors into consideration going forward. Um, and federal aid will just be part of the package. I'm sure there'll be a broad appeal to philanthropists, to private donations, to organizations, to deal with this as quickly as possible. Because the infrastructure alone is the insurance companies. By the way, another factor is that many of the state farm insurance company actually canceled coverage for some of the houses before this happened due to the inherent risk of the locations where they're built. So that's going to be another problem. Some people have been left without their homes completely, and there's no insurance to cover it. So they're facing an even more of an uphill battle financially than everyone else. Another question is what happens to the insurance company policies after this incident? Is there going to be more pressure for them to restore coverage to high risk areas? Does this mean that people should simply not be living in parts of the country that are prone to particular environmental conditions? If that's the case, then Florida is another likely location we should be looking at in terms of water damage, hurricane damage, and so forth. Does that mean that everyone will now have to relocate to areas that are considered safe by insurance companies? And should the insurance companies be driving where people live? All of these questions are long-term problems emerging from this scenario.
Alex, Isaac, there have been reports of looting with curfews being put in place. The areas that have been hit by these fires, some of them extremely affluent. How do you think that authorities in such a case of crisis can counter that potential criminal activity and focus their energies on what they need to?
That's a really difficult question, I think. It's already seen yesterday, we had a lot of the authorities, the mayor came out and said, you will be arrested. It's a federal crime if you even come back into the area. So they're trying to ensure that people weren't coming back, so trying to evacuate them. And of course, now we've had those people being arrested and someone was arrested for arson, but it's quite difficult to have the manpower. They already don't have the manpower to put out the fires that are still ongoing, to ensure that they can get across the board more people, more authorities, more police. I understand that they are considering bringing in some higher authorities, potentially military, to try and stop people going back to their homes, to stop the looting happening. But it is one of those things that it does quite happen when we come to one of the disaster areas. People, sadly, will go and loot what they can, where they can. But looking at the devastating fires and the range of the fire, there isn't that much actually to go and loot. You know, we're looking at quite a lot of images of completely ruined houses that goes on for miles. And it is about safety as well, ensuring that people don't go back their houses too soon. There could potentially be small gas explosions, underground problems, and it's going to be quite difficult for the authorities to control everybody. They can't quite put a border around everything and stop people coming in, coming out. So that's something that they will have to consider and potentially look to, as I said, to the military or you know, at least some private security firms to help out.
Ross Feingold, if we're looking at people who have evacuated their homes and are coming back to scenes that have been described as apocalyptic, what could the impact be for people who aren't covered with insurance? And will there be governmental support there? And what impact could that have on the US economy?
Well, certainly, to answer your latter question, certainly the U.S. economy is going to suffer from this. Los Angeles is a major economic engine. It's obviously the home of movie making and television programs. And it's also a big destination for tourists, whether that's domestic tourists or tourists from overseas. But when it comes to people who are not sufficiently insured, it really remains to be seen whether or not the federal government will step in. As I mentioned earlier, this becomes very political, and whether or not the Republican majority, because the Republicans now have the majority in both the House and the Senate, and obviously they control the White House with President Trump taking office in a few days, whether or not the Republicans are willing to increase the amount of financial aid that's available to the people who've been affected by this. That's really something of an unknown. It's something that Congress might start to look at within the next few weeks. But again, with Republicans, California, and especially Los Angeles being a heavily Democratic area, is not someplace that Republicans in Congress have a very warm spot for.
Irina Zuckerman, continuing on looking at the future now, we of course are looking at a developing scene, but these people and the lives that are going to be affected for potentially generations if they lose everything, is there a feeling of support amongst America where people will come together? We've already mentioned, of course, that there might be private investors joining in, but in terms of understanding the American community and understanding how America gets over disasters, natural disasters, we've seen hurricanes, we've seen, of course, storms that have wreaked havoc, but do you think there will be a big response from the country as a whole to support those who have lost everything?
I think so. I think overall and in general, the Americans tend to be very supportive. U.S. is considered, in terms of charitable donations, one of the top donors in the world, both to internal causes and to outside causes. So I would expect the same in this particular scenario. One concern, however, is that some of the media coverage emphasizing exclusively celebrity disasters creates a wrong impression with the people that most of the damage is to wealthy people who can afford to rebuild on their own. I think more coverage needs more coverage needs to be extended to regular people who lost their homes, in order not to create wrong impression. Because it's not that people are all inherently unsympathetic to the wealthy people, but simply if there is a shortage of resources, you don't feel the need to dedicate it to something where somebody can afford to deal with it anyway. But the other concern is the politicization or attempted politicization by some voices of this issue that tends to put the blame on the people who live there for voting for bad governments and for essentially being at fault for the portion of the disaster that was human made. I also think that such voices are not helpful at the moment. I certainly believe there should be reckoning and accountability by government actors, but I don't think that should be the focus right now, and I don't think it's helpful to detract from the impact of the tragedy by focusing on government mistakes as opposed to getting help as quickly as possible in the moment.
We are now joined, sorry to cut you off, Irina, we are now joined by Vamsi Patluri, who was an eyewitness in Los Angeles. Vamsi, thank you so much for joining us. We've sort of moved on from the actual incident itself, but now you are here, I would really like to get an understanding of what the scene is on the ground. What can you see, what have you seen, and can you describe the devastation that's been caused in Los Angeles?
All right, guys, thank you for inviting me. What I've seen is something that I've never experienced in my life. I was driving through the roads of Pasadena and I see schools burned down, houses burned down, and it's like an actual apocalypse happening in LA right now. The saddest part is there's a new fire in Sunset that started a couple days ago, which is burning down the hills around the famous Hollywood sign. And it's all crazy over here. People are being evacuated. The hotels are all being sold out every single day. There are some areas under mandatory evacuation, and there are a few more places where people are scared that the fire is gonna reach their homes, so they are evacuating and moving to hotels like 30 or 50 miles away from their places.
Vamsi, in terms of the people, the feeling must be one of somber, one of sadness, but also one of fear. Is there panic? Is there sadness? Can you describe the feeling amongst people that you're around?
Definitely, I have a few friends who live in that area, and they're so worried that their homes that they've been living in for years are going to be burned down. and it's extremely heartbreaking to see how they have no clue over what's going on in their area, because there's no active news being reported from the areas, because there's everyone's evacuated from their areas, and the fire is is getting so big, and the winds are blowing at 30 or 40 miles an hour. There's no way to control it. So you see how people from those areas have are going through a lot of hardships right now because of the fires. I've talked to a couple of them, and they have no clue what's going on in their places.
Ramsey, is there a feeling that more could have been done? We've seen criticism going out to the mayor, going out to the governor, but is there discontent amongst the people still in LA who haven't fled?
Well, what I think is, I don't think there's discontent with people, but I do feel like the government could have done more. Although the firefighters are actively fighting, and even they're running out of resources because the fires are so huge, and the government can only do so much, right?
Ramsey, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our other guests, Serena Suckerman, Ross Feingold and Alex Isat. As the case and the fires develop in LA, we will of course continue to bring you all of the updates, also from North America and also the world.